Firstly, a few words, very few, about ICAHD UK, Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions. ICAHD's always taken a political position and called for a just, sustainable solution for both people groups through the establishment of one democratic state called for by Palestinians, which prompted ICAHD to call not only for an end to the occupation, but for the end of settler colonialism itself. Founded in 2004 to support the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions, its focus for mobilization has been on Israel's demolition of Palestinian homes within the occupied Palestinian territories of West Bank, East Jerusalem, Gaza, and Israel itself. We provide a platform for all opposing the Israeli government's militarization, its violations of international law, and discrimination of the Palestinian community everywhere. Founding director of ICAHD and Nobel Peace Prize nominee Jeff Halper is on the steering committee of the One Democratic State campaign. He gained a PhD in anthropology from University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. He taught at universities in Israel, the US, Central America, and Africa. His book, War Against the People, brilliant read, reveals the Israeli government's high-tech weaponry security systems and methods of classification perfected on Palestinians in the occupied territories, exposing technologies of control, blurring lines between the military, domestic security agencies, and the police, and the Israeli government's pivotal role in the worldwide suppression of human rights. His latest book, Decolonizing Israel, Liberating Palestine, Zionism, Settler Colonialism, and the Case for One Democratic State. Today, we're very honored that Jeff is in conversation with esteemed investigative journalist Andrew Feinstein, exposing corruption over arms deals carried out under the post-Mandela ANC government, quote, the point at which the ANC lost its moral compass. He was prompted to seek exile to the UK. In his brilliantly comprehensive book, Shadow World, Inside the Global Arms Trade, on the mendacious privatization of the war industry, he reveals, shockingly, the illicit bribes, money laundering, and wide-scale corruption behind international weaponry deals and revolving door relationships within the US military-industrial complex. Manufacturing and trading weapons, he argues, are closely tied into the machinations of governments, militaries, intelligence agencies, and crucially to political parties. His book inspired the riveting documentary Shadow World, which is available on YouTube, gaining a wide audience even after 6 years. He's the founding director of Shadow World Investigations, formerly Corruption Watch, and currently is in the business of putting out at least 4 new books, including a graphic novel, which sounds very exciting. After Andrew and Jeff's discussion, which will last probably about 45 minutes, we will throw it open to you, all our esteemed participants, for questions which we invite you to put in the chat box, which I can then relay to the speakers, after which they'll both give their final thoughts on any message they feel important on how best to support a democratic process in Israel and the occupied territories. So now I've got great pleasure in handing over to Jeff and Andrew. Thank you for waiting so long.
Jeff, I think you might be muted. Now it's okay? Yeah, yep. Now we can. No, I don't know. I wasn't muted, but I don't know why it didn't kick in. All right. So again, thank you all for joining us. Thank you to Norma for the introduction, to Malcolm for the technical assistance, And certainly to Andrew, who's an old friend of mine, for agreeing to join into this conversation. One reason why I think it might be useful is that Andrew's interests and my interests really kind of are parallel, and then once in a while converge. You know, we've both written books about the arms trade. Andrew has been, you know, also very involved with the Palestinian issue. And in particular, and this is where I want to start, I think those of us active in the Palestinian issue, including many Palestinians, of course, really look at South Africa as a model, in a way, for a strategic path, a political path that that the Palestinians could take. You know, there's many forms of settler colonialism. I mean, both are countries that had you know, were defined in the last century or so by settler colonialism. And in a way, they're both similar in the sense that, let's say, unlike Algeria, where the settlers left, or Kenya or Mozambique and other parts of Africa, or unlike the US and Canada and Australia and New Zealand, where the settler population got so huge and overwhelming that it really dwarfed and marginalized the indigenous population. So there's no chance of overthrowing settler colonialism. And so the indigenous there have to have different strategies of how they cope with a settler country that they live in. In South Africa and Palestine, you had, in a sense, a minority population coming in, you know, taking over the country, but when the liberation movement begins, they both discover that they have a settler population that's too large to be expelled. This isn't good. Neither South Africa nor Palestine are going to be Algeria. But at the same time, of course, unlike the United States and Australia and others, the indigenous population weren't marginalized. They were large enough. They still had national aspirations. They still were in a liberation struggle, so that you had this idea of liberation and in a sense ending settler colonialism, maybe taking our country back in a way, but being stuck with a large, embedded, powerful, economically powerful as well, settler population that isn't going anywhere. So in a sense, I think in a way, both the South Africans and the Palestinians are struggling with some of the same question about what does the end of settler colonialism look like, and how do we structure a country that's on the one hand independent and free, but on the other hand has a settler population that becomes a decolonized. And that's another issue. How was it decolonized so that the ex-settler population would fit into the new post-colonial country? So maybe just start in a very general way, Andrew, and you know, think what you think of these, and in general, is it a good comparison, a useful comparison between South Africa and Palestine?
Thanks, Jeff, and great to be with you. I must just apologize up front if my speech is a little less distinct than normal. I'm suffering a really bad mouth infection, but hopefully you'll all be able to hear me properly. It's always wonderful to be in touch with you, to be in conversation with you. And I think the sort of issue that you've hit on is an extremely important one, given the situation both in the Palestinian struggle and in some ways in South Africa. You know, obviously South Africa has created a democratic state. That state has huge challenges. Many in the country, especially amongst the majority of people, would argue that many aspects of settler colonialism, or what Colin Bundy described in his quite brilliant thesis of colonialism of a special type. You know, there are still massive economic challenges. The economic inequities in the country, which is one of the 3 most unequal countries on the planet, are almost entirely racially defined, with one change since democracy in 1994, which is that a very small minority of Black South Africans have become a part of the elite. And many of them are also part of the ruling elite. So the sort of confluence of the ruling and economic elite, the political and economic elite, is profound. The lack of benefit in material terms to the vast majority of South Africans remains a huge challenge and a huge issue. Unemployment, formal unemployment in South Africa, just to give you some sort of indication, is running at 37% at the moment. Partly a factor of the pandemic and lockdowns, but even before the pandemic, it was in the high 20s, early 30s. So that just gives some extent of the scale. You know, I suppose the starting point for me is that, you know, there are some obvious differences in the situations. And most people who are with us today will know those differences. So very briefly, the demographics. White South Africans were only 12% of the total population at the time of our winning our liberation. Obviously, very different regional dynamics in the two places. And of course, simply because of differences in historical moment, geopolitical differences that were very important in bringing an end to apartheid in South Africa. And we can talk about that some more if you'd like to. Another very important distinction that I think we should mention is the economic distinction, in that the majority of South Africans, the predominantly Black population, was needed by the minority for economic purposes. So they provided very cheap, very badly treated labor, particularly on the mines, which were the lifeblood, obviously, of the South African apartheid economy. And so the calculation for the South Africans was about how, for as little cost as possible, they maintain this almost indentured working population in a way that I don't think is quite the same in Palestine. I think there is another difference, and I mean, I haven't really thought this through, but you know, in recent years, I have the sense that particularly in the US, in the UK, and in Western Europe, the Palestinian struggle is being silenced in many ways. Whereas in the case of the South African struggle against apartheid, certainly from the late 70s through the 80s and early 90s, there was a lot of support globally, so that even governments that were, excuse me, that were very supportive of the apartheid regime had to do so clandestinely. That's not the case with Israel at the moment, obviously. So I think that's an important distinction that we should be aware of. I don't know if you want to talk about some of the similarities now, Jeff, or just focus on those for a moment.
Well, I mean, no, I don't want to lose the thread. So let's look at some of the similarities. Maybe go on and then we'll come back.
Sure. So, you know, I think the important similarities, as you say, these are both settler colonial struggles. As I say, Colin Bundy had a particular take on that, which was very resonant in the South African context. I'm not sure he ever looked at the Palestinian context at all in his theoretical work, but I might be wrong. You know, what was so clear about the apartheid state in its very early forms from 1910 onwards was the theft of land, which was so critical to the process of settler colonialism as it has been in Palestine, and the process of divide and rule in ever more fragmented pieces of land. In South Africa, what we call the Bantustans, or the homelands. I think the other important similarity that starts to touch on some of our other work, Jeff, is the use of extreme force and violence in quite untrammeled and unfettered ways in both situations. But there's something else that I want to mention that I think is really important. And that is the profound dehumanization of the other that takes place in these sorts of settler colonial regimes or situations. And I think this is perhaps where almost the most long-lasting damage is done, that is not always immediately apparent to outsiders, but to those of us living within these conflicts is so obvious and so much a part of the difficulty of overcoming the sorts of divisions and separations that have been created. It would be interesting, Jeff, and I know you have some views on this, it would also be interesting to look at some of the similarities and some of the differences of the various liberation movements across Palestine and South Africa, because I think, you know, we always think in the South African context of this, of the ANC as something of a monolithic liberation movement, and we sometimes forget that at periods during the 60s and the 70s, the ANC was really not perceived as the leader of the liberation struggle, except by those who were of the ANC itself. I mean, there were many, you know, the rise, the split of the Pan-Africanist Congress, which had issues with the ANC's non-racism, the rise of the Black consciousness movement and figures like Steve Biko, who really galvanized the struggle against apartheid in South Africa for the youth of the country. And the ANC really played second fiddle for periods of time, even though it had, and I think this is a very important factor when thinking of the Palestinian struggle, even though there was this sort of guiding document that the ANC had that had been adopted in 1955, something called the Freedom Charter. And I think that speaks to a really important constituent of the liberation forces in South Africa. The ANC in particular was an incredibly broad church. And it was a broad church in terms of its leadership, in terms of its demographic identity, but also in terms of ideology. I mean, it was astonishing for me in '94, first going into parliament, to see just on economic issues how, you know, the ANC included people who I could have easily described as Thatcherite or Reaganite on the one hand, all the way through to the very far left on the other, and pretty much everything in between. And I think that was part of a strategy to try and be as inclusive as possible, that had both benefits in the struggle years, but disadvantages as we went through the transition. Let me leave it there for the moment.
Well, one of the, I mean, it's interesting. One of the differences that just to highlight what you're just saying is in a sense a reverse process where the ANC begins to arise. And I'd like you to speak more about the rise of the ANC and its leadership and its political program. But in a sense, the ANC begins to rise together with other Afrikanist groups and other groups and so on, and gradually begins to formulate a program that seems to be, like you're saying, attractive to a broad range of people, including some whites in South Africa as well, and Asians. You have the leadership emerging. You have you know, an engagement politically and so on, increasing until it gets to a point just before the end, you know, when it's agreed that the party is in the transition period, where in a sense the ANC and its leadership enter into negotiations with the government, almost as on a parity basis. In other words, not some liberation movement out of the bush, you know, meeting sophisticated government people, but really being able to deal with them, and in many ways even assert their positions over that of what you'd expect to be a more sophisticated, formal government kind of a structure. Whereas on the other hand, the Palestinians had the PLO. I mean, they had a national leadership. They had a political plan in the beginning, in the 70s at least, from the late 60s into the 70s. It was an explicitly anti-colonial, you know, total liberation political plan. It was the Palestinian Liberation Organization. But over time, and maybe this gets into the geopolitics that you were referring to, over time that starts to unravel. And I think the PLO begins to feel going into the especially after the agreement with Begin Sadat and beginning the normalization process with the Arab world, and then Oslo and so on, the PLO begins to feel more and more marginalized, and that it has to begin to play the game that Israel and the US and the national community have dictated to it. And they begin to adopt the two-state idea, abandon the anti-colonial. But then in the end, the whole PLO is dismantled. In fact, by Arafat himself, when he became the head of the Palestinian Authority. And that's, so today there is no national leadership after Arafat. There is no national movement. There is no national organization. There is no political plan. And there's not even engagement. I mean, Israeli leaders haven't met Palestinian leaders for I think now 7 years. So, and as you're saying, Zionism has an acceptability that apartheid was never able to attain. So I guess that really, puts the Palestinians in a bind from the point of not only don't we have a political plan, in some ways, maybe the South African case was easier as well, because you didn't need a sophisticated political plan. It was a one person, one vote, basically, and it was fairly straightforward. Whereas here, you've got to get we're talking about, two states, and some people are talking about confederations, and there's federations, and there's one state. And, if you ask Palestinians, you'll get 10 different answers about what is your political plan, what is your vision, and so on. Total liberation, still with Hamas and so on. So they seem to be in a more difficult situation, both internally and in terms of outside powers, than the ANC. The ANC seemed to be in a position where it got stronger and stronger and became a government on the way, where the Palestinians have sort of almost retreated from that kind of a position until today. They're extremely marginalized.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think those are all great points. I think that there are a number of factors. The ANC's strength increased as the power of the regime weakened.
Mm-hmm.
And the weakening of the power of the regime was only partly due to the ANC. So that's something, I think geopolitics were an important part of that as well. Right. So that's something there was, in some senses, we were fortunate in terms of historical timing, if you will. But we shouldn't forget that the ANC, which of course saw the PLO as a fraternal organization, and there were very close links. I mean, I met Chairman Arafat when he came to address our parliament, and listening to him and President Mandela conversing was quite an experience, because their histories were so similar in many ways in terms of the way they thought. And of course, I think you identify absolutely a crucial difference, which is that, the ANC would have no truck with the Bantustan system whatsoever. And anybody who participated in the governance of those Bantustans in any form was excommunicated, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
It was only after the fact that one or two people who had been in leadership positions in the Bantustans were welcomed into the ANC. And that was just playing strategic politics once we became an electoral party, where of course everything changes. But during the struggle for liberation, any sort of complicity with governance in the Bantustans was way beyond the pale. And they were seen as apartheid collaborators, end of story. So in that sense, it was also a little bit easier with the situation of the West Bank, Gaza, etc.
They wouldn't truck a Palestinian Authority.
Absolutely not.
South Africa.
No, because that was seen as complicity with the oppressor, which of course, I mean, some Palestinians share the same position. Mm-hmm. It's also important, and when the comparisons are made, obviously, I'm very conversant with the South African reality, and my understanding of Palestine is far more superficial and facile. There aren't that many people who have this sort of detailed understanding of both that is so useful. You, Jeff, have probably come closest of most people that I know with your knowledge of South Africa, in addition to your experience in Palestine. But it is important to bear in mind that the leadership of the ANC as a movement was a leadership that had constant differences amongst itself. There were divisions, there was mistrust. We went through all sorts of iterations of leadership crises. You know, we had different poles of leadership because from the 50s, when the ANC was banned, some of our leadership was intentionally and explicitly sent into exile. So Oliver Tambo, who was president of the ANC for many decades, led the movement from London. And that was really to build up the opposition to apartheid, to build up the BDS campaign. The internal leadership in the 1980s, when the ANC reasserted itself locally, it created the United Democratic Front, which was in essence a legal front for the banned ANC. And there was a whole core of leadership that developed around the UDF. And the UDF, you know, remembering that the ANC is a Congress movement. So each, and I almost don't like saying this in the nomenclature of apartheid, but each racial group had its own Congress that was then affiliated with the broader African National Congress. So you had the Congress of Democrats, which was for whites, of which my father was a member. You had the Indian National Congress. You had the Women's League. You had the Youth League. You had the South African Communist Party, which was in formal alliance with the ANC. And of course, you had the trade union movement in formal alliance. So leadership was actually quite diffuse and dispersed. And it was a problem when the ANC was unbanned, trying to integrate those various strands of leadership into a coherent organization that could run elections and take over the government of the country. And believe me, being on the inside during the transition process, I worked as a facilitator in the negotiations process. So I sort of was extremely fortunate that I sat in on meetings that I otherwise would have been far too junior to ever get near. And the sorts of divisions within our own leadership, because I, of course, had already been a member of the ANC since the 1980s. And I thought that the apartheid intelligence services didn't realize that. On my first day as a facilitator, the head of national intelligence, a terrifying man called Neil Barnard, called me in, and with his piercing blue eyes, he sort of confronted me about 5 centimeters from my face. And he said, "Mr. Feinstein, we know exactly where your political allegiances lie. We have no misconceptions about your neutrality as a facilitator." But, you know, they weren't able to kick me out because the ANC insisted on my staying there. And I saw the divisions internally about, you know, every major and every minor decision. And I think we were very fortunate to have a personality as strong as Nelson Mandela at the time that we did. Because I think that he had the moral authority, as I think Yasser Arafat had for a period of time. But Mandela had the moral authority when he emerged from prison to force the disparate leadership to unite behind certain positions. And it was really in the succession to Mandela that the sort of divisions in the leadership played out. And those were divisions between Thabo Mbeki's supporters on the one hand, who became his successor, and his pursuit of what could only be described as neoliberal economic politics, amongst some other awful things, his support for Mugabe in Zimbabwe, his awful positions on HIV and AIDS, and particularly on the provision of antiretrovirals. But there were 2 other camps. There was Cyril Ramaphosa, who was sort of more of a centrist economically, a bit closer to the youth than Mbeki ever was. And then there was Chris Hani, who was tragically assassinated. And Hani was a firebrand young leader who Mandela says used to remind him of himself when he was president of the ANC Youth League, and he fought successfully for the adoption of the armed struggle by the ANC. But I think So there's certain leadership lessons there. I think the reality of that guiding document of the Freedom Charter, so all these different congresses came together in 1955, just outside Johannesburg in a place called Kliptown, where they adopted this broad manifesto. And obviously in government, the manifesto was interpreted in numerous different ways, but it provided a broad unifying framework. And, you know, so on the economy, and it was incredibly broad and vague. So on the economy, you know, it had statements like, the wealth of the country shall belong to all who live in it. Now that could of course be interpreted in, you know, thousands of different ways, and has been. But it gave one a sense of a struggle for economic emancipation, not just national emancipation. So in that sense was important. Non-racism, which was at the core of the Freedom Charter, was extremely important and a non-negotiable to the ANC. But it's also worth remembering, you know, at the time of our first election, I mean, I ran a huge electoral district for the ANC that was predominantly white still. And people there, you know, they didn't have the views of Nelson Mandela that soon became the norm. I mean, they saw him as this terrifying communist ogre who was going to take away their cars, their swimming pools, their whites-only schools, all of their privileges. And, you know, and some of them claimed their jobs and various other things. And it didn't matter how conciliatory he was in those transitional years leading up to the first election. That was the view of the vast majority of white South Africans. And you don't overcome generations of media indoctrination, of educational indoctrination, and of dehumanization, which I mentioned earlier.
But they did go through a transition, the white population. In other words, they could have resisted, which I know if some Afrikaners wanted to do, but some of the hardcore, but I mean, they could have, I mean, Mandela and the ANC must have softened in a way that, or prepared the whites for a transition period. Otherwise, if they would have all of a sudden hit transition with this ogre and the communism, why wouldn't they have chosen to resist instead of
well, some of them
going
did.
through the transition?
Some of them did. But I think it's important to understand, before coming to those whites who did try and resist militarily, that, you know, crucial in, I mean, apartheid collapsed for a number of reasons. One was a very important military defeat in Angola, in a place called Quito Kinavale, where the South African Defense Force, which I had to study endlessly to avoid serving in, and eventually had to flee the country when they just canceled my student deferment after many, many years. They suffered a shocking defeat at the hands of the Angolans and the Cubans. And that brought to an end South Africa's strategy of effectively militarily controlling all of what were called the frontline states in Southern Africa, the states that bordered on South Africa, and trying to insert moderate black regimes in those states. Quito Kinavale was the end of that fantasy. The second thing that was very important was, as a consequence of the BDS movement, which of course was incredibly powerful globally, in the early to mid 1980s, when students across the world, but particularly in the United States and the United Kingdom, started boycotting Barclays Bank in the UK, and it's changed its name so many times, I can't remember what it was called then, JP Morgan, Chase Manhattan, whatever it was at that point in the US, because these were the two biggest providers of foreign exchange to the apartheid regime and enabled the regime to continue functioning. When these two banks realized that they were about to lose an entire generation of potential customers because all of these students were going to other banks for their student loans, that was the point at which the so-called group of 20 banks started renegotiating South Africa's debt arrangements. And the impact that that had on the country, together with a collapse in prices of raw materials that was so crucial to our economy, meant that the standard of living of white South Africans had started to decline. And that was really important in terms of F.W. de Klerk, who came from the right wing of the National Party, making the decision to start negotiating with the ANC in good faith and to actually envisage some sort of a transition.
All right, well, let me approach the same thing from the other direction. You were talking about, why the whites finally, sort of agreed or didn't really agree, but went into the transition. In the other direction, when we're dealing with, I'm involved with the One Democratic State campaign, which is a Palestinian-led group, to try to really detail and present a concrete plan of one democratic state to get out of this whole mess. But as our Palestinian members approach many Palestinians, especially young people, they get back this thing of normalization. Wait, you want a state? What? You want to live with Israelis? You want Israelis speak? So in a way, there's an interesting thing. I can't represent Palestinians, but I would think that most Palestinians realize that Israelis are going to stay. They're not going to leave or be thrown out. But they don't really want. But they don't want to deal with that, with what that means in terms of moving ahead in the future. So I know in South Africa you had the Afrikaners, I think, who also were against the non-racial policy, that wanted South Africa to be black. And I'm not sure what their conception of where the white population would be, what they do, whites and Asians and others. But, are there any lessons that the Palestinians could take from South Africa in terms of how the ANC managed to get the Black African population that had lived in these terrible conditions under apartheid to agree on that they would agree that the whites would be equal members of society? That's something Palestinians, I think, are resisting to some degree.
I think the starting point, and this is not an uncontroversial point by any means, but I do think that the brutality of the occupation in Palestine is in some ways a lot worse than what Black South Africans experienced in South Africa. And I think that makes that reconciliation so much more difficult. The other factor that becomes really important here is leadership. And, I think what Arafat was trying to do by turning into the Palestinian Authority, at the same time as trying to convince Palestinians that there was a future that involved Jewish Israelis. The problem was that he couldn't really deliver on either of those because of the nature of the Palestinian Authority. Whereas in Mandela's case, Mandela was assuming power. So of course, there were elements within the movement, within the broader movement, so not just the ANC, who were totally opposed to any sort of accommodation with whites. There is still a minority movement of that sort in South Africa, especially amongst younger people. In the transitional years, that led to some violence by some of these people, where, for instance, in one instance, there was a massacre in a predominantly white church congregation. And similarly, there was violence from the white side towards innocent Black Africans. This is going to sound very unanalytic, Jeff. I think the most important factors were twofold. One, the power of Mandela as a leader, and how brilliantly he articulated his message of reconciliation symbolically. So things that he did very early on. Even before he was president of the country, he went to visit the 97-year-old widow of the architect of apartheid, a guy called Hendrik Verwoerd. His widow lived in this little colony that even after 94 wanted to remain purely white. Mandela went to visit her in person and spoke to her just like he would speak to any other lovely old Boba. Then, you know, the rugby. Those sorts of things were incredibly important. Wearing the rugby jersey of the white captain of the rugby team that won the World Cup in 1995. Rugby, you know, the hierarchy in South Africa while I was growing up was rugby, then religion. I mean, that's the reality of it. And he knew that. And he knew that because he'd learned the language of his oppressors in jail, and he learned about them as people while he was in jail. The second thing is that South Africans generally, and here I talk about the vast majority of Black South Africans, but also the predominantly Afrikaans-speaking South Africans, are incredibly adaptable, much more so than the English speakers. The way in which white Afrikaners very quickly took to the new order, much quicker than their English-speaking counterparts in the white community. But then there is the other thing, and that is that the ANC in no way threatened the standard of living of white South Africans, the comfort level of white South Africans. Remember, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission never looked at the role of companies in sustaining the apartheid state. Remember that there has been no forced repossession of land in the country, even though there is a land crisis in the country. The economy has remained a neoliberal economy that favors a tiny elite at the expense of a vast majority. So white South Africans could see that their lifestyle was in fact being improved. They could now travel overseas much more easily. They could watch international sport. They could do business internationally. They didn't only have to list their companies on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. So there was a lot of tangible stuff. And that was offered to white South Africa. Remember, before the government started engaging with the ANC, white business did. So I think the one lesson to be learned, and you know, who am I to suggest lessons for Palestinians, but if I can draw some broad thoughts from the South African experience that might be helpful. You have to talk, not always formally. We were very lucky that we had, across the vast demographic diversity of South Africa, we had some people who were committed to talking to each other. There was a chap who many of you might never have heard of called Frederick van Zyl-Slabbert, who was Afrikaans speaking, rose to be leader of the white Liberal Party, who was sort of very conservative economically, but on human rights were more liberal. And van Zyl-Slabbert left parliamentary politics, which he thought were a waste of time because only whites voted. And he started an organization called the Institute for Democratic Alternatives for South Africa. And what they did for many years before there were formal discussions between the ANC and the state, he organized for groups of South African business people and other prominent white South Africans to meet with groups of ANC leaders, usually in Senegal or other places outside the country. And I think this is something that very importantly needs to be happening in Palestine, is that elements of the Palestinian community and of the Israeli community need to be talking, but not those elements, Jeff, you know, the very, very few, very remarkable people on both sides who work together and talk together. It needs to be from those who are less instinctively willing to engage and to talk. And I think there is enormous space for that sort of informal interaction to happen far more.
So one I guess, lesson, I think where the Palestinians actually might succeed more than the ANC did, is in this issue of decolonization. In other words, the ANC managed to liberate the country, politically at least, and get a new government and so on. But they didn't decolonize the settler colonial regime. On the contrary, they left the foundations, as you're presenting it, intact fairly much. So like you say, there's a small black elite that got in, but basically it's almost the same. So the Palestinians have to be careful to, and I think they're very aware of that, to to say, well, one democratic, and in fact, that's really what some of the pushback we get when we try to present the one democratic state. Many Palestinians will say, it's a trick. It's really an attempt by Israel to maintain its control under the guise of a democratic state. Because, you can always, like South Africa, you can always have people in parliament,
sure.
Palestinians in parliament, but that doesn't give them real economic and political power, and the land issue and so on. So the Palestinians, I would think, would really have to be much more specific with themselves in terms of what exactly does decolonization mean in order to avoid what happened in South Africa.
Absolutely. And I think, for me, part of that mind shift is coming to terms with the reality that the colonizers, like in South Africa, are going to be there. Mm. And therefore starting to look for partners in that community. And the thing about looking for partners is it's obviously easier to find people who think exactly as you do. In the situation in Palestine, it's far more difficult to find Israeli Jews who might actually have no truck with a single democratic state notion, but who believe that the current status quo is unsustainable.
You see, but that goes counter to the Palestinian idea of normalization. It's interesting, in South Africa, it sounds like normalization meant against Black South Africans that were cooperating with the apartheid regime, like in Bantustans. Whereas in Palestine, normalization, it's true, the Palestinian Authority is also accused of normalization, but normalization is Palestinians dealing with Israelis that do not accept the three principles of BDS, and so very much structurally, the Palestinians are prevented by this idea of normalization to have any relations with Israelis that don't fall outside of that small box of those like me who accept those three principles. So that's a structural limitation the Palestinians sort of imposed on themselves, it seems.
Sure, but this is a big psychological and political step that South Africans had to take too. Because yes, part of normalization, because the ANC was a non-racial movement, part of the normalization was this understanding that there were certainly going to be some whites there. And that, in fact, they could play a role in the struggle. That was a very important differentiating factor as well. We had the Joe Slovos. We had the Ruth Firsts. We had, so many incredibly committed and courageous white activists who at the time were completely shunned by the white community, and who suddenly, the white community then embraced as heroes. With this sort of revisionist thinking where, to find a white South African who was actually in favor of apartheid now is a very difficult task. Funny how before 1994 it was so easy, but be that as it may. I think for Black South Africans, especially younger Black South Africans who were more militant in their understanding of normalization, many of those who'd grown up in the movement inspired by Steve Biko, they had to come to terms with the fact that the future democratic South Africa was going to be side by side with white South Africans. And again, the role that the leadership played in that, someone like Chris Hani, who was seen as a militant, who had come up through the military struggle. Hani would spend an inordinate amount of time with young, radical Black South Africans, explaining to them why to build a successful democratic state, we were going to have to build that state with some of the whites, and we weren't going to be able to pick and choose those whites. So a lot of them were going to be the very people who had tortured and oppressed us.
All right, Norma, I pushed Norma to give us an hour, so we have a couple more minutes. Okay?
Sure.
There's so much more, Andrew, to talk. We haven't got to the arms issues and everything. We'll have to do this again. But there is one more.
Let's make this the start of a conversation.
Right. But there is one more issue I just want to touch on quickly in terms of all of this. Another, that I think is really relevant. Maybe there's a similarity with our struggles. And that is, the ANC really didn't have, many partners in the white community, certainly not in the government and so on. So like you're saying with Oliver Tambo, I think part of the strategy of the ANC was to bypass the whites and bypass the government and go to the international community, especially to the international civil society. I mean, all of us of my age were involved in the anti-apartheid struggle. BDS was what everybody did. The difference being that BDS, for you guys, had an end game to it. One person, one vote. Whereas with us, BDS is completely disconnected from anything political. And I think that's a fatal flaw but it's not BDS's fault because the Palestinians don't have a political plan yet. But BDS is a tool. It's not a standalone sort of a thing. But the point I want to make is that the ANC managed to mobilize the international grassroots that then began to affect their governments in favor of supporting the ANC. And it seems to me the Palestinians have that same situation. They don't have many Israelis to talk to, and certainly not the parties and not the government and not the religious community and so on. So that what I'm sort of suggesting to them is that they also bypass, because what you get from many Palestinians is there can never be one state because the Israelis will never agree. You see, they made Israel into the deciding power of what the parameters, what are achievable. Whereas if they would say, forget the Israelis, our real allies, the Palestinians' real allies are you guys, the international civil society. And you're the ones who can mobilize, although you have to have a political plan to mobilize around. So from that point of view, it seems that there's a similarity here where the ANC understood that the international community was its ally, the grassroots, not the governments, whereas the Palestinians maybe are beginning a little bit, but haven't really adopted that as a strategy. Certainly the PA doesn't at all appeal to the international community.
Not at all. I mean, I do see Palestinian formations engaging with international civil society, not as much as they need to be doing, or that they have the capacity probably to do at the moment. I would say, I agree with that entirely, but I would say one other thing as well. I think you can find allies in Israeli society. Listen, if I was Palestinian and looking at the state of Israeli politics, I would not see a lot of light there. That is for sure.
Absolutely.
I mean, Israel for me is just so reflective of how bloody awful politics are everywhere in the world. And, the caliber of politician, the corruption, and that's both material and moral corruption, is so deep-seated and so profound. The lack of any sort of broader interest than one's own little power game. One has to look elsewhere in the society for allies. And the one way in which one can do that in a society is to look at the economic levers. And here, because the Israeli economy is so embedded in homeland security, the defense industries, et cetera, that's perhaps more difficult to do. But there's also a sort of a huge non-military tech industry in Israel, amongst other things. And I think these are people who perhaps have the potential to be partners. It might be inconceivable at the moment, but these are people who, for economic reasons, might be able to have leverage on the state. That's what happened in South Africa, is there were some business people who purely out of self-interest realized that apartheid was unsustainable for them.
Okay. Shall I?
All right, reluctantly, we have to leave it at that. And Norma?
Okay, thank you, folks. I'll just, maybe these questions will feed into the debate anyway. How much impact, from Aeneas, I think it is, how much impact do you think the human rights organizations, Al-Haq, Human Rights Watch, B'Tselem, Yesh Din, Amnesty, Sabeel reports showing Israel practicing the crime of apartheid has had on Western and complying countries to the West. How is it possible to achieve change if, in the case of the assassination of the Palestinian journalist Shireen, the USA is unwilling to listen to investigation reports from CNN, New York Times, forensic architect Jabit Salem, showing that Shireen was most likely shot by an IDF soldier? That's one. Wait, you want to pitch in, and then I've got another question coming up.
Andrew, you want to?
Let me start on this, Jeff, and you just add anything that you feel on this. Because I see things from the outside. In terms of the human rights organizations, you know, many of us in the global civil society community had been getting a bit frustrated, to be honest with you, with organizations like Amnesty International and others for becoming less campaigning and quite often more moderate in their approach to human rights. And I think there has been, Palestine has proven to be a critical juncture in their reigniting that more courageous campaigning spirit that I think they were known for, certainly in the 80s and early 90s in my experience. Where I think they've had a huge impact is because I think there has been an enormous onslaught internationally, particularly in the US, UK, and Western Europe, by Israel to stop any criticism of Israel and to thwart the BDS movement. And I think, Jeff, your point about there not being one clear end goal of the BDS campaign is a very valid one. You know, ending occupation is obviously a goal, but it's a partial goal. And I think one has seen almost quite a desperate approach by Israel in some of this to try and equate any criticism of Israel, any support for BDS with anti-Semitism. And, you know, for sort of ethno-nationalist politicians in the West, it's a very easy thing to buy into, very sadly. And tragically, there are a lot of them around at the moment. I mean, we have one running our country in the UK at the moment, amongst others, you know, also corrupt and incompetent. He'd be very comfortable in Israeli politics, mendacious as anything.
He'd be very welcome.
Yeah. I think where a critical impact has been is amongst younger Jews around the world, where I have seen, I travel an enormous amount, obviously, since lockdown ended, in Western Europe, in the States, and obviously around the UK in the arms trade work that I do. And our work, you know, you can't de-link arms trade work from politics. The arms trade exists as it does because of our politics. And it really is a source of great hope to me that I find very impressive young Jews almost everywhere I go, many of whom have actually seen their views on Israel change. They've become far more critical. And the ability of global civil society to refer to what Israel practices as apartheid has obviously been made a lot easier. And I think that's very important. And I think it's very important in terms of the BDS movement, which I still think is the best possibility for peaceful change that we have.
All right, can I say a word, Norma?
Yeah, sure. Now I've got two more big issues coming up.
Okay, all right, I'll be brief. You know, international law and Israel's violations of international law aren't going to change the situation. In other words, Israel can violate international law with impunity, and it can get away with it because it knows that there will be no sanctions. There might be a little criticism here or there, but the United States, you know, the enforcer of international law is basically the Security Council. And with the United States and Britain and other friends of Israel on this Security Council, Israel has nothing to fear from that. So, you know, we can't put too much importance on international law as a force for change. But Richard Falk, I mean, many of you know Richard Falk, who used to be the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in the occupied territory, makes a very good distinction between, military strength and what he calls the war of legitimacy. And what he says is, many countries, including South Africa, certainly had the military hand. I mean, the ANC and its military wing were no match for the South African government, even though maybe they lost to the Cubans. but they couldn't have beaten South Africa militarily. The Palestinians, obviously, I mean, even have less of it, have no chance whatsoever of denting Israel's military strength. But the war of legitimacy, Richard Falk says, is even more important, because if you lose the war of legitimacy, that opens the floodgates to sanctions, not necessarily by the UN, but by many other groups, corporation sanctions. It begins to soil your reputation. Corporations and others don't want to be associated with you. It begins to alienate the Jewish community, as Andrew's saying, especially young Jews today, I think. So in a sense, the ability of Human Rights Watch and Amnesty and B'Tselem and others to label Israel, to give it a name, to label it as an apartheid regime, goes a long way. Jimmy Carter started that, years ago. It goes a long way towards opening the possibility of criticizing Israel, legitimizing criticism, and of really delegitimizing the Israeli regime. And that becomes very important in terms of beginning to open up channels of discussion about where are we going now. If apartheid is unacceptable and the two-state solution is gone, that begins to open the door towards discussions of formerly forbidden topics like the one democratic state idea.
Great. Thank you, Aeneas Murray, for that question, and thank you both for your answers. Two things together now from Penny Leigh Brown. Andrew says that so much depended in South Africa on both communities meeting, working and talking together. Surely that is the very thing, maybe you've answered this already, that is being so vigorously prevented by the Israeli system of control. Do you see this ever changing? And if so, how? And from Tara Lamb, in Northern Ireland, education system helped produce new generations who are invested in the peace process. Do you see any potential for this in Israel, Palestine? And after this, we've got one more big question I hope we'll have time for. Thanks, folks.
Jeff, do you want to go first on this one?
No, you do it.
Okay. So, I mean, it's absolutely clear why Israel stops it, for the same reason the South African apartheid state did. When people start talking to each other, they realize that they have far more in common than they have differences. This is the huge inconvenience of humanity for politicians, is that we actually generally tend to like each other and tend to have a lot in common. So yes, of course, any oppressive authoritarian state that wants to survive in its very narrow form is going to prevent interaction between the oppressed and the oppressor. That also makes it more difficult for the oppressor to realize how much the oppression impacts them. And this is something that many white South Africans are still coming to terms with, is their complicity in a brutal system for so long. And the reality that while, of course, the impacts on white South Africans were minuscule by comparison, very few white South Africans were murdered by the apartheid state. White South Africans weren't restricted in what education they got and what jobs they could do, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But the psychic corrosion of being an oppressor is, in my opinion, profound and deep-seated. And there are some South Africans who, unfortunately, never in their lifetimes are going to overcome them. And what is even sadder is some of them can't help themselves but speak out publicly as well. And they belong to a different era, a different generation. They should go and join an Israeli political party or Donald Trump's re-election campaign, because that's the sort of worldview and mindset that they exist in. So what do you do? We need to do what Van Zyl Slabbert and others did. We need to break past that. And we need to get Israelis and Palestinians communicating on an equal footing as widely and as often as possible. And yes, of course, it'll start very, very slowly. Mm-hmm. But I think South Africa can play a crucial role here. And I even have some ideas about where this could be done, who could fund it, et cetera, that we must continue to talk about, because I really regard this as the start of a very long conversation. So I agree. I think that is key. And I think Israel will do everything in its power to resist. And possibly some in Palestinian communities might also. But I think for those who truly want peace, who want justice, and who want equality, it is essential that human beings start talking to each other across this divide. Then when it comes to education, of course, ideally, that is where you've got to start inculcating a basic humanity in people. And those three principles have to be the basis for that humanity. That is not going to happen in the current dispensation. It didn't happen in South Africa. If I had to show you my history books, I mean, it's embarrassing now how my children, who both study history at university, have to teach me about world history. Because the South African apartheid regime intentionally tried to de-educate not only the Black majority, but white South Africans as well. It's why we only got television in 1976, and for about another 5 or 6 years, only for an hour a night. The more ignorant and stupid we were, the more apartheid was likely to continue. So we need to, as a global civil society, we need to start thinking of ways of breaking through those barriers that the state is going to set up to ensure that we can't use education, that we can't use engagement and interaction. We've got to figure out ways to bypass them. And they will try everything they can to stop us, including calling us all sorts of ridiculous names. Mm-hmm. The same thing happened to me in apartheid South Africa. As soon as it was known that I'd been involved with the ANC for decades, the things that I was called by white South Africans were just ridiculous. Mm-hmm. And the same sort of things apply if you try and contest Israel's hegemony at all. Yeah. But I think there are enough people in global civil society who would be willing to deal with the labels and to actually do what is right to see a lasting solution in Palestine ultimately.
I agree with you, Andrew, but with a caveat. Naturally, because you know, we're supposed to be having a discussion here. I can't just agree with you.
And we have different experience.
Yeah, and that is, you know, I mean, I don't agree in a way that Israel's preventing that kind of dialogue. On the contrary, from Oslo on, there was too much dialogue. The Palestinians just got tired of it, and they got disappointed with it all. I mean, even now, there's a group called the Geneva Initiative of Yossi Beilin and I can't remember the Palestinian's name right now. I know it, but never mind. That's getting business leaders together and government leaders. I mean, they have conferences all over the world like that. The problem with that is that there's no agenda. In other words, I keep going back to this like a mantra, and people are getting tired of me saying this. Without a political plan, all this is just talk, because in all the dialogue groups, they were either let's get to know each other, and of course the Israelis start with the Holocaust, and that shuts down the whole thing, or it's on the basis of the two-state solution. That's really in other words, Israelis will go into a dialogue with Palestinians, but only if it's a safe dialogue. Not an open-ended dialogue about decolonization and settler. Israelis will walk out the minute you say settler colonialism or apartheid. So they're willing to engage with Palestinians on the basis of a solution that leaves Israel intact, the two-state solution in particular. And so I think that if we want to try to initiate these more critical, political, liberationist type dialogues that you're talking about, Andrew, we have to do it on the basis of a political program. If not a program that's all worked out and accepted by Palestinians, because that's going to take a while, at least on the idea that, you know, there is settler colonialism, that we have to go beyond the two-state. We have to begin to imagine together, and then begin a conversation about decolonization, which is a pretty threatening term, but with Israeli, at least some, if not decision makers, at least the economic elite, some of the intellectual elite and so on, to do that. So I don't think the problem is dialogue per se. Although again, you've got I think there's more pushback on the Palestinians' part. They resist dialogue more than the Israelis do.
I would say to you that what you're talking about,
to have an agenda.
Yeah, but what you're talking about isn't dialogue that's going on. It's not dialogue. Yes, it's conversations, and a lot of it will be PR.
Right.
It's not dialogue.
That's right.
A dialogue is when you can raise all of these issues. You know.
So we have to structure them. We have to structure those conversations, and we have to structure them politically.
Of course,
not just get the people together.
No, of course. And the issue you have is: can you have the political plan before you start the dialogue, or does the political plan emerge out of the dialogue?
That's right.
It sounds like the next conversation. Sorry to butt in.
No. Just to say one thing, because in South Africa, when the dialogue started, you know, business leaders wouldn't go to the table unless they were told something called consociational development was on the table. Now, none of them actually knew what that was, and I don't think anybody on the planet really knew what that was. They had this idea that South Africa could be governed in some sort of federal way that would retain all of their power and influence. And they wanted that to be the starting point. And it took a Van Zyl Slabbert to persuade them that it's not a dialogue if you're deciding what has to be on the table before you get round the table.
Right.
Sure. Do we have time to add one more question, Malcolm? Yeah, okay.
We have till 7:30, right? Or 5:30 your time.
Yeah. Question from Nigel Mohammed. We've already really touched on this. What can be learned from the Oslo talks that did not achieve its objectives? Settler expansionism seemed to be happening even during the Oslo talks. Does that mean that the ethnocentrism of Zionism prevents constructive negotiation? And from Carol Bergman, what about artists and writers, International Pen, etc., a good forum?
So I'm leaving the first question for Jeff to start with. In rugby parlance, that's known as a hospital pass.
Well, I mean, I think the problem with Oslo and since and before and after is that again, there was no political agenda to it. You know, in other words, in Oslo, Israel agreed to negotiate with the Palestinians, but there was no agreement on what they were negotiating on. In other words, Arafat always used to say, we're negotiating the two-state solution. And Rabin would always correct him and say, no, we're not. Because if we're negotiating a two-state solution, we're prejudicing the outcome before we start the negotiations. Maybe there'll be a two-state solution, but we're not committing ourselves. So it was all open-ended, and in the end it fell apart because obviously Israel used that as a, you know, and of course nothing prevented Israel from expanding its settler population. In other words, during those 7 years of negotiations, the occupation and the colonialism got immensely stronger than it had been. So the whole system served Israel. And that's why I think the idea of our one democratic state campaign is that the Palestinians have to take control of this process. I think maybe that's one lesson of the ANC. The ANC took control. In other words, there was internal divisions, there were external constraints, there were all kinds of things. They were called terrorists by the international community and so on. But nevertheless, they took control. They had plans, they had strategies, they had leadership, they had organization, and all that is sort of lacking today. So I guess you know the Oslo is sort of a cautionary tale, and that is you cannot go into negotiations with a stronger power unless you know where you're going. And unless you have a say in terms of determining the parameters of the discussions and the agenda, without that, it's a trap. And I think the Palestinians got trapped, and I think they're still in the trap.
I would agree with that analysis completely. I think to add a little bit to what Jeff was saying about the ANC taking control, at one point in our negotiations, and there was always this assumption that the ANC had no choice but to continue negotiation. At one point in the negotiation, Mandela discovered that the apartheid regime was still running what was called a third force, a clandestine military force made up primarily of military members of the Inkatha Freedom Party, members of the South African Defence Force, and some of the police services. And they were attacking ANC members in Black communities around the country. There were massacres. There was one in a place called Boipatong, where 89 people were murdered one night in their single-sex hostel. And F.W. de Klerk was sat on the stage at the negotiations, expecting to announce the successful end of the first phase and the beginning of the second phase with Mandela. Mandela was late, which, contrary to perception, was actually quite unusual for him. When he walked in, I'd never seen him like this. I was sat on the stage to the side of de Klerk because I was supposed to be handling protocol. I could see something was different with Mandela. He stormed onto the stage. De Klerk was sitting down. He didn't let him stand up. He stood above him and he pointed in his face. And he said to him, "You have betrayed me. You have lied to me. I will never trust you again." And he turned around and he literally walked out of the negotiation hall. And that was the point at which it was absolutely clear to everyone in South Africa and the world who was in control. And from that point on, F.W. de Klerk, he might have had the title of president, but he was no longer in power in the country. And everything went into a transitional arrangement after that, because that is the only way he could get the ANC back to the table. But his position had to be sufficiently weakened for him to get to that point. And that was about BDS. That was about the geopolitical factors, etc. He honestly believed, F.W. de Klerk honestly believed, and he says this in his autobiography, he honestly believed that he was going to retain power in South Africa because the majority of Black Africans were moderate and they were going to vote for people like Chief Mangosuthu Buthelezi and other leaders of the Bantustan, and that together they were going to be the biggest group in parliament. He honestly believed that when he started the process. As the process transpired, he realized that that was a fantasy that was unachievable. In terms of the second question, very quickly, in terms of writers and others, there are some extraordinarily courageous writers, artists in the world. There are not enough of them who are prepared to speak out about the situation in Palestine at the moment. And I've seen a quieting of those voices. And the quieting of those voices has come about because of the way in which any criticism of Israel is perceived as anti-Semitism, etc., etc. And the time is now for us to start insisting that writers refine their courage. What is happening in Palestine is the greatest human rights catastrophe of our age. It is the greatest injustice of our lives. And we have a responsibility to ensure that people of influence, like writers, write about this, speak about this. There are far too few of them today. In fact, the opposite is happening. There is an event coming to the UK in which Jewish writers, both novelists, playwrights, one of the most senior editors at The Guardian, have produced a piece of, they call it theater or stage production, to give voice to the voiceless who are themselves. These are people who in British society have amongst the most prominent voices in formal, organized platforms, and they now describe themselves as the voiceless. And when things like that are happening, it is very difficult for those who think differently to speak out and to be dissident. We have a responsibility to continue to remind writers, artists of the importance of truth and of the crucial importance of speaking truth to power. Because we cannot let the situation continue as it is currently. And we cannot wait until the generation, many generations below us, who are seeing through a lot of the Israeli propaganda, are of an age when they can take up the cudgels. We can't afford to wait another 2 or 3 generations.
Well, Andrew, thank you for that urgent clarion call, speaking truth to power, which inspires everyone, I imagine, including me, to be braver and speak out more consistently. Thank you both for really very stimulating, incisive debate. And let's hope this is just the first part, and maybe we could continue it in a couple of months' time if you're both free, because it threw up so many questions we didn't have time to expand enough or completely answer. But I think you've both done a brilliant job, and I hope everybody found it as stimulating as I did. Wonderful, says Penny Lay Brown. Thank you to both. And an interesting comment from Maureen Purcell, who says, Andrew is a gold mine. I don't know if you've ever been compared to a gold mine before, but anyway.
South African gold mine.
Yeah, absolutely.
Can I say that I feel more like a cement mixer at the moment with what I'm having to put in my mouth? But may I just add one thing? First of all, thank you so much for inviting me to this conversation. To be in touch with Jeff again is just such a wonderful privilege. It really is. You know, I look up to Jeff as somebody who has epitomized real courage his entire life. And I think the world needs people with courage more than ever before, perhaps, very sadly. I think what we should do is we should think about how we can broaden this conversation slightly as we go forward. Every time, just broaden it a bit to Palestinians, to Israelis, to others in our own communities, to South Africans, definitely. I would love to include a few South Africans. But then I do just want to give you one last anecdote, because I would hate people to leave here with no hope. Because I know the situation in Palestine feels intractable. It feels desperate and devastating. In 1986, I had to leave South Africa to avoid serving in the apartheid military at 48 hours notice. I drove my little 50cc motorbike to the top of a little hill that overlooks Cape Town. And I honestly thought I would never see my homeland again. Because if anybody had told me at that point that 5 years later, Mandela would be free, the ANC would be unbanned, I could go home, that another 4 years after that, he would be president, I would ridiculously be an MP, and everything that happened in our country with all its challenges, I would have used one of my many trainings, which was as a clinical psychologist, and I would have offered them a straitjacket, because there was absolutely no prospect of it. Apartheid South Africa seemed at its most powerful. 5 years later, that is what has happened. And I was incredibly fortunate to see my own country, with all its problems and challenges, become a democracy. Not a complete democracy, but a democracy. And one day, it will happen in Palestine.
Here.
Inshallah.
Thanks,
All right, thank you, Andrew. Thanks, Norma, for moderating, and thanks to everybody for joining.
I think, unfortunately, I've just got to give a bit of information, folks, before we say goodnight. There's very few notices about upcoming activities from Malcolm, including the next webinar, Wednesday, July 20th at 5 o'clock, and the next study tour coming up to Palestine and Israel in November, which I, like so many others, found life-changing. And apart from that, I'd like to ask you all to visit the ICAHD website, where background info, including stories, photos, sample letters for political representatives and detailed suggested action, can be found in the campaign section of the website. Thank you to all our brilliant speakers and you, our international audience, for taking part so dynamically in tonight's event, which will be available on the website, hopefully in a couple of days. Apologies for anybody whose questions we couldn't incorporate next time. Support ICAHD UK, sign up for the newsletter, become a member, attend, donate to events, and join us as we work to bring peace to the Middle East and, in particular, freedom and equality for all Palestinians. Thank you, folks.